After modeling the request, let's look at the HTTP response. Here is an example HTTP 1.1 response. It starts with a status line similar to the request. The status line is followed by a list of all the headers separated by new lines. And at the end there are two new lines, after which the body of the response follows. For our server, we don't really care about the headers, so we will ignore them, and our response will only have a status line followed by the actual body. If we examine the status line, we see that it starts with the protocol, which would be HTTP 1.1. This is followed by the status code and by the reason phrase for this status code. Let's go back to the editor and create a file for the response. In the HTTP folder, we create a new file and we call it response.rs. We also have to add the response module to the mod.rs file so that the compiler will actually check that new file. To represent the response, we would need a fairly simple struct. So let's create a new public struct that we will call response, and this struct will need to store the status code and the body. So the HTTP status codes are a finite set of numbers, so to represent them it would be best to use an enum. So we can say that our status code will be of type status code, and we will implement this enum later, but for now let's just define an empty one up here so that the compiler will not complain. We also need a body, and this body can be anything, some JSON or the contents of an HTML file. To support all cases, let's make the body a string, but not all responses will have a body. So to handle the cases where the response will not have a body, we will actually wrap an option around the string. Now we can create a response without providing any body. Let's also add a constructor for the response. So if we create an implementation block for the response, in it we need a public associated function that we'll call new. And new will have to take a status code, which will be of type status code, and it will need to take a body, which will be an option of a string, and it will return a new self. Okay, and in here we just create a new response passing the status code and the body. And of course the compiler complains because the current status code that we're using is private, so we have to make it public because it is part of the public interface. The last thing to do is to also export the response struct in the mod.rs file. So in here we can say pubuse from response, we want to use response.